On May 14th, we had the shooting in Buffalo. And then in less than 2 weeks, 2 days ago, we had another shooting at the Texas elementary school. So it's beyond heartbreaking, and it impacts us, and all of us over here, I think, have a shared goal: empathy and justice. So thank you for being here tonight. And I would like to start with saying thank you to all people who donated us and helped us to maintain these social series. First of all, thank you to the Connecticut Health Foundation for their support. They are supporting us to improve the infrastructure of our programming. And thank you to Dr. Klee, who made it possible for us to receive this grant. Also, thank you to our donors. You see at the platinum level, supporters and friends. At the platinum level, we had comprehensive neuropsychological services, and I am proud to say that I'm affiliated with this company. Also, you see Hartford Healthcare. Thank you so much for your generous support. At the supporters level, you see your beautiful names, and also you see your beautiful name at the friends level. Thanks everyone, and welcome to our speaker, Dr. Tran. I'm going to turn it over to Janan to provide you with more information.
Thank you, Shiva, and thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Janan. I also serve as the co-chair for the Social Justice Speaker Series, and I am just thrilled that you are here, and hopes that we can share some information with you all, but really in hopes of curating community with folks who are also invested in social justice issues. So we have an exciting speaker planned for this evening, and I just want to give a little bit of background information about the Social Justice Speaker Series. This is our second year of programming for CPA, and we are committed to combating racism, promoting community healing, and social justice. We're really invested in... I think I got muted. There we go. We are really invested in being advocates for change. So this is our fourth speaker series for this year, and we have the honor of hosting Dr. Nellie Tran. As a quick reminder, we will offer free monthly speaker series throughout the year, and CPA members are invited to attend, as well as folks from the broader Connecticut community and our nationwide supporters as well. We are also excited that this year we'll be offering CE credits for psychologists for selected speaker series throughout the year, and that includes tonight's talk. Again, as the co-chair, I welcome you this evening, and I hope that you will enjoy tonight's session. I am now going to turn it over to Mena, one of the planning committee members, to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mena. This time I'm going to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Nellie Tran. Dr. Tran is an associate professor at San Diego State University with community-based Block Multicultural Community Counseling Program. And she's also the immediate past president of the Asian American Psychological Association. She's a community psychologist who works with schools, communities, and agencies to create systems-level changes that reduce the impact of subtle forms of discrimination, such as microaggressions on people of color and women within the workplace, educational, and counseling context. So I'd really like to welcome Dr. Tran. So turn it over to Dr. Tran now.
Thank you so much to the CPA and to Minna for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this topic. I think that it's great that folks are here, that you all have come to learn about anti-Asian hate and what's kind of going on for the Asian American community. And especially right now, I think that visibility keeps waning in and out. And the violence that our country as a whole is experiencing at this time, I think means that we have a lot to think about. And let me share with you what I have. So I could obviously talk about this topic all day, but we only have probably about 45 minutes together. And I'd love to engage in conversation to see where you are all at after a presentation. So I will go through this and then we can have a conversation. So let me see here. Let me share my screen. Can you all see the proper page? Thank you. Okay, so today's talk is on anti-Asian hate. I love to start with this image because I think this is from one of the Oscars many years ago when the hashtag #OscarSoWhite became, and then Chris Rock was the host, and there was this spotlight on how white the Oscars are. And then this moment came when these children came on with the results of the one of the Oscars awards, and they were holding a suitcase. And Chris Rock went on to make a joke about them, being that we could, that we could be assured that the voting was done correctly because they're math whizzes, right? So this was a play on the Asian stereotype that Asians are good at math. But most importantly at that moment is that these children didn't realize that they were playing into a stereotype where they were the butt of the joke. And for me, this really spotlighted in this country how invisible anti-Asian hate has been historically and to our present day. So I start with this image to remind us that anti-Asian hate has been in front of us for a long time. And what I hope I spotlight throughout this presentation is that there may be an amplification in what we see, but not necessarily in how pervasive it has historically been. So I am the daughter of Vietnamese refugee boat people. My family came to the US in the 80s. That's the only picture, I don't know how they got it, of my mom and dad on the, they had left the refugee camp for a moment to go to the beach. And that was at the refugee camps. I'm also the mother of two, a wife and a sister and a daughter. I'm a community psychologist by training, a counselor educator, and all of that. But I think it's important to understand kind of where I'm coming from, that this is a deeply personal topic for me. I've been, the last several years have gone on to do many presentations on this, but it is something that that affects me every day. And I often tell reporters that the reason why they're reaching out to me is because I've been writing and studying and talking about this topic for well over a decade. So how could this topic be new if you know of my name because I've been doing this work for that long? And it's these moments that we forget how much we know, right? How pervasive and how invisible Asian Americans have been. I think we have to remember that and see that. So I want all of you to think for a moment and to be honest with yourself, because you're not reporting out to any of us, but rather just thinking about this for yourself. But when you think about Asian Americans, what comes to mind? Right? Can you name anti-Asian sentiments from your own upbringing? Right? Think about how you thought about Asian people growing up. How much do you know about Asian American history? When did the first Asian American come to the US? Can you name can you name any Asian American activists, civil rights activists? More than one? What parts of US history involve people and communities from the Asian diaspora, right? Any formal education you might have received on the topic? Any that come to mind now that we've been kind of embedded in and had anti-Asian sentiments kind of more visible to us? How much education have you offered yourself over the last couple years, right? And can you name one anti-Asian belief that is difficult for you to disprove, right? Are there ones that you're still holding on to? Perhaps you want to, perhaps you don't know to, but that you just can't shake, right? and hold on to that, because I think one of the points I'm going to make here is that this starts with you, right? In this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID and racism and how the two of them came together to produce what we call a syndemic. And then I'll move into and backtrack us through history, the history of anti-Asian hate in the US. And I'll talk about this impact of racism on Asian Americans. And then lastly, I'll end with some suggestions for clinical practice, and we'll go into a Q&A. And if I've done my job well, I hope that I will have achieved two goals. One is that you will see that history, context, and systems matter. And two, that it starts with you, the provider, that if you don't see these things as a problem, if you can't acknowledge or see the biases that might come through in your clinical practice, that is where anti-Asian hate and racism will begin to occur, right? And that it is an opportunity that we have when clients come in to talk about healing. So COVID, I mean, it's not over, but we've been going through this thing called, COVID-19, and it happened in synergy with other existing pandemics. And this is what we call a syndemic, right? It's the overlapping and interplay between two existing pandemics, and it started. The first person who coined this word was Meryl Singer to understand how the HIV epidemic among those most impacted, right? So it was looking at Black people and communities and how they were overly represented and impacted by the HIV movement, right? So that racism and the HIV pandemic or epidemic were colliding with each other and amplifying the effects, widening the gaps, right? So they're not just merely co-occurring epidemics, but that there's a synergy between the two. The two of them together make everything wider and bigger and worse. And so the syndemic of COVID-19 and the US racial reckoning of 2020 have created this system where we're seeing more reporting of violence and hate towards not just Asian Americans, but really all communities of color and all marginalized communities. And what we know from the pandemic is that these top-down decisions have impacted individual abilities to protect their well-being, right? That we've been mandated, there's mask mandates, vaccine mandates, school closures, that all of these things have an impact on who we are and how we can protect ourselves, right? That there's a disproportionate impact on minorities and low-income populations who have to endure the loss of income or have been socially distant due to living situations. And that the impact on women and unpaid caregiving responsibilities, especially for those who lack the social support systems to care for their young humans in their life, that there's been an increase in domestic violence worldwide. So just the COVID pandemic alone created a very dangerous situation for our mental health, right? And that communities of color, those in low income populations, were already at a disproportionately high risk of being harmed by the pandemic. And then we add on to that the fact that recent reports show this dramatic increase in reported hate crimes across all groups, including Asian Americans. And so together then, these two things are bringing to head what we're currently seeing now, right? And it's important for us to remember that it's not just this moment, that Asian Americans, like other groups, racial groups and minorities, have with them generational trauma, right? That there are effects of trauma that have been transmitted to future generations from a history of belonging to oppressive systems, war traumas, right? The traumas of colonization and the war traumas or the traumas of migration are all already in existence for Asian Americans. There's also cultural traumas, right? Experiences that cause dramatic loss of identity and meaning in the social fabric of our Asian American communities, right? It generally affects groups of people who have already achieved some degree of cohesion. So even Asian Americans living with the perpetual trauma of being targets, that here in the US, Asian American is a recognizable category. And so when Asian Americans are targeted, there's a vicarious trauma that can happen because Asian Americans are often asked to represent the entire community. And then so when things happen to groups of Asian Americans, even if they are across the country, there still might be cultural traumas that are impacting individuals across the Asian Americans across other state lines. There's also racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress, which are mental and emotional injuries caused by encounters with racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. And this really is where people are focusing. But I think it's important to remember that racial trauma is just one type of stressor or trauma that many Asian Americans are struggling to incorporate into this trauma schema that they already carry. So how do we get here, right? We have to go back. That this moment of Stop Asian Hate and all of the protesting didn't just start now, that this is actually a repeat in history, that there's just a visibility. And I think it's really important for us to think about how this moment is about what we see, right? That the media has given this a lot of attention, that there's more people talking about this, there's more people willing to make space for this part of the racial reckoning, right? That anti-Asian hate has been in existence, but we have to take a step back because it's not actually new. How did we get here? And of course, we have to remember that the Asian diaspora itself is very diverse. And so even the experiences that I'm going to talk about has to acknowledge the fact that in the US, we have many different people from many different countries within Asia, right? This is just the 2012 census categorization, but you can see that this is very, very different. And in fact, there are colonizing countries among the Asian American diaspora, right? There's colonizers and there are oppressors, even within the Asian American category and the diaspora. But the category of Asian American, which is the one that we're talking about, was something that was developed in the 60s as part of the civil rights movement, right? It's a political term, just like the word woman of color or communities of color, people of color, BIPOC. These are all political terms, that there was a need to come together as a collective, despite our very diverse histories of how we got to the US, right? Suggesting that there was already anti-Asian sentiments well before 1960s when there was a need to come together to fight for rights, right? So the moment that we're seeing now is not new, right? We often talk about the model minority stereotype as the predominant stereotype of Asian Americans. And again, this started in the 1960s as a counter argument to the civil rights movement, that Asian Americans were being pitted against other groups of color as an example, a model of the successes that are possible in the US. And so Asian Americans were being shown as a model and used. It wasn't their own telling of their story, right? But you have to take a step back because the history of anti-Asian hate did not just start in the 60s. It did not start with just these quote unquote positive stereotypes that we even within the academic community, I think has overly emphasized the role of the model minority. And in many ways, then I'd make the argument that we've played into this idea that there's only this positive stereotype. And what we're seeing now is that the xenophobic mentioning of China, anti-Chinese government or anti-Chinese sentiments that came out of the COVID, the starting of COVID and how China was getting the blame for COVID was bringing up very old stereotypes of yellow peril, where Asian Americans have always been seen as the perpetual foreigner, that no matter how many generations you've been in the US, you would never truly be American. And that we know this even in, there's always been a fear of Asians in America, right? We have political examples of executive orders such as the Japanese American internment. And often we think of this as, during World War II, that it was Japanese citizens that were interned, but that's not true. They were Americans, right? So some of the bans that we saw folks talking about in modern day society happened. They happened in the 40s with the Japanese Americans, right? And that the US already had this fear of folks of Asian descent. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first major law restricting immigration to the US, right? And earlier, Buddhism and other kind of Asian religions were seen as a cult, right? But they've been co-opted since then to be in aspects that are in all of the aspects that are more beneficial for folks, have been extracted from the religion in order to propagate different ideas. But originally, it was seen as something that was barbaric that came out of Asian culture. But once you remove the Asian from it, then you can have mindfulness practices, and that would be okay to promote here in the US, right? Even within our media, we can see that Asian Americans have continued to be sidekicks or the comic relief, right? So not only do we have government policies that have limited Asian Americans and have created propaganda that are anti-Asian, but are, in Hollywood and in the media, within our music, within our sports, things that are prominent within US culture, Asian Americans continue to be on the sidelines, right? There is no representation. And when there is representation, we are being used for someone else's entertainment, to promote somebody else within a movie, right? You're the sidekick, you're the comic relief, perhaps you're even, there just to make sure that the storyline makes sense, but that's all that we have. So even in our recent storylines around anti-Asian hate, I think, most recently, Grey's Anatomy tried to showcase anti-Asian hate within their storylines in a hospital, but they had no leading characters to even show the phenomenon. So they had to use all of their side actors, right, in order to actually show how anti-Asian hate was showing up in the hospitals. So it reminded me also that we know that kids in schools, that Asian Americans, when they have this was all the way back in 2012 that I did this fact sheet about bullying and victimization of Asian American students. And generally what we found is that when Asian American students report being bullied, it is most likely to have been in the classroom and to be racially motivated. Typically, kids were reporting that they were made fun of because of how they look, right? That they're made fun of by their eyes or about their size, and that anti-Asian hate for many of these kids were already happening and prevalent in their early lives. So this idea that anti-Asian hate is new, or that it is something that we're just seeing because people are mentally ill and therefore attacking Asians, or that the rhetoric is somehow just from the Trump era and how he was talking about COVID, is simply not true. It has been this way throughout history. And we can see and track how Asian Americans have consistently been victimized in policy as well as in early childhood education, in the media. And indeed, our research also supports how Asian Americans are typically triangulated between whites and blacks, and that are still invisible, right? So when these traumas happened and people were victimized and that they experienced anti-Asian hate, people will say that they're always shocked but never surprised, right? That this too is the sentiment for many Asian Americans, not just other communities that have experienced hate crimes. Many of the students that I've worked with and those in the community had reported feeling numb after seeing such incidences as the ones in Atlanta, right? The shooting of the spa workers in Atlanta, that they actually were numb to this because these types of experiences had happened to them in their own communities, but never getting public visibility. And my own mother was a manicurist and had been at gunpoint many times in her career, never made the news, never called a hate crime, but certainly manicurist shops here in San Diego were targeted for a time, right? And we know that this, racism is linked to, so perceived racism. Much of our research has been on whether victims perceive and report racist incidences, that it affects mental health outcomes. There's no surprise there, right? That when you experience and perceive racism, you're at an increased risk of mental disorders and depressive symptoms. You have higher negative affect, lower self-esteem. You're less satisfied with your life. You have a reduced sense of community or connectedness with others in your community, right? And we also know that language and racial discrimination prevents people from seeking healthcare, and that's associated then with increased numbers of chronic health conditions. We also see that language discrimination for Asian Americans are associated with health conditions beyond just racial discrimination, so that there is other forms of discrimination that even within our psychological research is just starting to increase our ability to see what types of racism do Asian Americans experience and how is that impacting their health. We also know that feelings of objectification and eroticization also leads to reports of isolation, emotional numbing, struggles with ethnic and national identities, and emotional distress. And we know that fetishization is racism, especially for Asian Americans. And yet we also see that this, so there's the gender dynamic in all of this that we have to consider when folks are feeling as though they're coming to us to talk about racist encounters that they might have. And this matters because clinicians, you have the opportunity here to support healing, but you also have the opportunity to amplify trauma, right? To make things worse. And I think this is why this conversation is so important among service providers, because folks are coming to you for help, right? To heal. And if you don't say and offer a healing experience, then the opportunity for the trauma to be worse or for people to step away from counseling and therapy and not come back increases, right? I think of this as, this is the continuum that I think about how our biases and why you are so important in this. So we think of implicit bias, something like the American way is the right way, right? Something that we might hold as an ideal, but not even realize that we hold that ideal, could result in us doing things that are microaggressive, such as encouraging clients to cut off ties with family in order to work towards individuation, right? We hear Asian American clients say this a lot, that their counselors and therapists tell them that, they need to find their own way when students are, when we're working with students, let's say, are often trying to find a major, but they're having trouble figuring out how to stand up to their parents who want them to be doctors and engineers, that they're often told, well, just do what you want, find your passion, follow your path, but not recognizing the students did say that they wanted to do what their parents wanted them to do, right? They want their parents to buy into their decisions, but oftentimes we hear that they report counselors aren't supportive of that as a goal, right? Doing what makes their family happy or their parents happy. And so then that results in things like Asian Americans reporting higher levels of feeling isolation and having suicidal ideation. But we don't necessarily link them all the way back to implicit biases that we might have. And that, I think, is the problem, is that we might want to reduce feelings of isolation and reduce suicidal ideation, but not realizing that as therapists, as providers, you and your implicit biases and how you decide to address these issues matters, right? Because you have at least two intervention points here, right? You could prevent your own implicit biases from turning into suggestions or motivation for your clients that could be microaggressive or racist. And you could also then prevent, if it occurs that you're called out that, what you said doesn't seem right for me, culturally speaking, like if a client were to call you out, could you do something to prevent that, having said that, from resulting in further harm to the client? And I think these are the 2 points that I really want to focus on. What can we do in these kind of 2 intervention points to prevent an implicit bias, something that you might not have a lot of control over? Because if this is the history that we come from, right? So if what I'm arguing that our history and our socialization has brought us to a place where anti-Asian biases and hate is normal, right? It is embedded in the culture that we come from. We have a strong history of it. It is not new. Then it is our responsibility then to prevent these things from resulting into harm for Asian American communities. So I would like to argue that it is our ethical responsibility to address and understand contextual and systemic factors. And what I think we need to do then is to bring racial discussions into the session, right? So if you know that about this history, then it might be easier then to ask, well, how does this, being an Asian American person impact your feelings about this incident, right? Because it's already present, it's already in the room, and it's up to you and using your power to acknowledge and amplify that moment, right? So you avoid missing cues to probe deeper. A lot of people, clients report testing their therapist, right? Testing their therapist with these little clues about whether they're racially aware enough for me to take the risk to share about this incident. Will they get it? Because if they won't get it, I'm not taking the risk of sharing, right? That when they test you with these little cues, if you miss those cues, the client will remember and you will have lost your opportunity to address possible anti-Asian sentiments that are in the room, right? Avoid advocating for the oppressive system over the client's feelings and well-being. I mean, some of this is just basics, right? But it's interesting because the more work I've seen with Asian Americans and the more I've talked to Asian American clients, the more I find that some of the basics of your clinical training gets lost when biases come into play, right? And this is because you have to know what your own biases are in order to prevent them so that you can stay in your strong clinical training, right? So using a holistic approach then, and avoid over-focusing on going inward and personal control. And that can be hard because often you only have the client in front of you, right? But how can you ensure that you're not just going inward, right? A lot of folks that are perhaps in their earlier years are not used to working in this more holistic fashion might ask a client, who shares kind of an anti-Asian moment that they might have experienced. And then the clinician might say, well, how do you deal with anger? And while that is useful, right, we certainly want to deal with anger, there's also a moment of validation that could be very useful, right? That to be able to say, well, that makes complete sense that you would be hurt by this, right? You are, how does it feel to be Asian American in a system that treats you this way, right? That doing both, that being able to ensure that you're both pushing inward, but also acknowledging what's happening outside, right? Is a more holistic approach, right? And don't promote assimilation without consent. And a lot of this has to do with consent. Do you know that your client wants to participate in American culture, wants to assimilate, right? Or are you doing that unconsciously, pushing for them to be a part of, a part of the norm, a part of, if you just do what people ask you to do, maybe your school environment, your workplace will just be easier, right? Be likable. When you're sending out those types of messages, what you might be asking an Asian American client to do is to assimilate, right? Don't push individuals away from family, friends, and community without consent, right? These are some really important factors to consider for Asian Americans who tend to be more communal. That if you ask them and you stigmatize staying in community with their family or doing what the family wishes, then you're suggesting that their family is bad, right? Shaming them for wanting community-oriented collectivism, right? Wanting to do what your family wishes of you is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Honoring your family is not necessarily a bad thing. There's perhaps lots to explore there, but to cut it off as, yes, but what do you want? When the client might have already shared with us, what I want to do is please my mom, right? Why is that bad? And to ask ourselves that, am I biased in saying that doing what someone else wants of me is a bad thing without understanding some of the cultural implications for keeping family in the loop when making decisions, right? Also, this idea of empowering our clients, right? Don't weaponize empowerment to make the client into some type of savior, right? It's great for us to build our clients up so that they can take power and control in their lives, but it is a whole nother thing to suggest that it is their responsibility, right? For Asian Americans and other people of color, it is not their fault that the system is oppressive and racist. It is not their fault that they're experiencing anti-Asian hate. So to feel as though it is now their responsibility to act to make it better is further perpetuating the idea that they are the problem and they are responsible. And that plays into gaslighting, right? They are hurt because they are victimized in this system. It's different, again, if the client wants to seek control and create change, but not at the start of the conversation, which is where problems tend to be. So additionally, doing this work well means starting with you as a clinician, right? The provider, and uncovering, acknowledging, and working on your own personal biases. It's about educating yourself, right? It's about consulting with others to understand where your own biases might lie, and acknowledging how you can bring that into the room. It's already in the room, right? Race conversations are already happening about your similarities and differences, whether you like it or not. The client may already be talking about it, so you might as well ask about it so that it can be an open conversation, right? Underprivileged people, including Asian Americans, can pick up on these subtle cues of bias, right? So own them and address it. When you catch yourself in it, or when you learn about it later, don't ignore and avoid it, but it's more effective to address it, to bring it up, and to apologize. Right? These are experiences that many people of color don't have, where someone returns and apologizes and corrects the behavior. The only ineffective response is ignoring the incident, and much of our research would suggest this, that you can respond in many imperfect ways. The only way that is ineffective for relationship building is to not address it, right? So once you acknowledge what has happened, once you feel as though you might have misstepped or put your foot in your mouth, it's important to address it, right? To not make it all about you, but to be sturdy enough to acknowledge where you might be falling short, right? Because racism is trauma. And if a racist something happens in the session, then you have just participated in more racial trauma for your client. Another thing is that vicarious trauma too is trauma. And I think we forget this sometimes, that watching, and I think this is more prevalent even today, right? As we're watching what's unfolding in Texas, that merely watching what is happening can be traumatic for others, especially for a community that has been asked to represent one another, right? So that as an Asian person, whenever I walk into a room and something about Asian Americans come up, I'm often asked to represent all of Asian America, right? And so when something happens to Asian Americans across this country, then why wouldn't I feel as though that also happened to someone within my community, right? So because we've been historically treated as a monolith, therefore we should expect there to be a collective community trauma, and that there would be traumatic responses for individuals as well. And that I really like this chart because it really highlights that there are so many ways that we might fall prey to, we call this the white supremacy system, but this is how anti-Asian hate happens, right? That it's these things that people are participating in that they're not sure, right? Having, believing in a post-racial world, believing that victims are responsible for the pain that they're in, believing that we're just one big human family, that all of these things are participating in a system that is promoting more anti-Asian hate. So I've listed here many resources for you. I realize over Zoom it might be difficult. You might need to take a screenshot of this. But there are many tools now available for bystander training, which is free from Holler Back. There's many new reports on Asian hate that has been circulating. And there's also a racial trauma toolkit that is really that I really like. That is both for Asian Americans as well as non-Asian Americans. And I think that we need to further make sure that when we're talking about diversity issues, that we are including Asian Americans and anti-Asian hate in the conversation, because I've noticed that it kind of comes in and out of the conversation as there is another violent crime, rather than it being integrated in a conversation about racism in general, which is what it is, right? We've got the anti-Asian hate, but it cannot be separated from all of the other racist agendas that exist out there. And that collectively, that's how we're going to fight this. That if we shall all do work on making a more anti-racist community and world and clinical practice, then we will stop the anti-Asian hate along the way, right? So long as there is racism, there will still be anti-Asian hate crimes. So let me stop there because I know we're running I want to make sure we have conversations, and I move through things a little bit quickly. That's my contact information if folks want to reach out. Let me stop the share for a second. Okay. So that's my point, is that we need to start at home. All of these conversations are wonderful, and that I really appreciate that folks are interested in increasing their cultural competency around Asian American communities and the Asian diaspora more broadly, and that there's a focus on anti-Asian hate right now. But it's a bit frustrating from our community because it's not new. And I think that has been the primary point that many of us have been trying to make, is that we need to keep this in conversation because it isn't new. It has a long history. And if we keep coming back to this every time there is a violent crime and not acknowledging the long history of anti-Asian hate in this country and all of the hate crimes that have existed, we won't make progress, right? Many of the hate crimes that we're seeing now have been documented by the Asian American community, by Asian American researchers, not by the government. But the reason it's unclear to us, some of the latest reports say that there has been a 300% increase over the last year of hate crimes. We don't know. As a researcher, I often question, has there really been an increase of 300%, or is it because reporting is up? That Asian Americans, not just folks within our community, but outside of our community, right? So even folks within Asian American communities, for the first time, are acknowledging and recognizing that there is something to report, right? Many of our immigrants within our community have thought that no one would care. Why would we report this, right? That's what my mom felt when she was held at gunpoint. And all of the anti-Asian sentiments that she experienced working in her business. In fact, I was talking to the anti-Asian hate folks a couple months ago, and realizing over the last 2 years, I've experienced anti-Asian hate crimes, anti-Asian experiences, but I never reported any of them. And I am a researcher who gives this talk. So if I'm not reporting it, who's reporting it? So there could be an underreporting, but there's also reporting is new. And there have been, I was looking up more incidences, and there have been incidences in Southeast Asian communities for decades, right? Like that there have been crimes against Southeast Asians because of the war and the refugee movement, but those never reached the national levels. And similar to police brutality and the crimes that our Black siblings have experienced, it's a lot of this amplification on the media has been because of cell phones, right? Having cell phones and video devices so that it can be sensationalized in the media, right? And that too, each time that happens, we should expect to see a rise in anxiety levels and a rise in fear, because now it's spotlighting something that, well, most people in low-income communities have always known, and those who are more privileged in communities where they can stay more isolated tend to forget that this is what happens out in the world. And certainly during COVID, those who were more able to isolate and shelter experienced it less than those who lived in big cities and went to had to use public transportation. So, but we can take questions and have more conversations. Obviously, this is an important conversation. I was trying to find out who.
Would you please mute yourself? Thank you.
Got it. So how does this land for folks?
Thank you, Dr. Tran. First of all, that was very, very important and interesting, that how those cultural biases just come into the session when we see patients. So is there any question?
Well, I actually go first for now. Throughout your talk, a lot of the things that you brought up were things that I've just never thought about. And I think that talks like this are important. So for example, just like Asian American history, that's something that I don't think I ever really got educated on throughout my education here in the US, throughout my middle school, high school, or just Asian advocates. I mean, that's something that has never really been highlighted, and it's not something that is talked about or covered in the media or within our textbooks and our classes and our courses. And so I think that there's so many layers to this, and step one is helping to have these conversations and ensuring that as a community, we are also advocating to change some of those higher end systems, upper systems, because without that, there's so many things that we can't really do and we can't really change for future generations. And so just wanted to say that when you brought those things up to me, it just really got me thinking, because yes, you know, we can be as culturally competent as we think we are, but at the end of the day, that's just our relationship with that client, but they're still facing a world in which many people really don't know what they're experiencing. And so I love the fact that you kind of talked about systems, because there's so much more to all of this than just our one-on-one interactions. And so just wanted to put my experiences out there, and hopefully that'll get the ball rolling in terms of questions and comments.
I really appreciate that, Neva. I feel like it's that very experience that you have insight into what it was like for you to learn the information, to acknowledge that it wasn't taught to you. And I think if you can acknowledge your process, right, when you're working with an Asian American client, that you then could ask those questions. Well, what do you know about your community's belongingness? You know, are you any different from other Asian Americans at your school, in your community? Have you talked to other people? That there's a way that we can advocate for pushing towards a system, right? Rather than merely asking about, going inward. That's part of the work, right? But if that's the only part of the work, then we end up with the anti-Asian hate embedded within the individual, which so many of by the time they get to me in their master's level programs, right? Many of my students can't even see the anti-Asian hate that they have in themselves, for themselves and their community. And that is not their fault, right? It's that there's an intentional miseducation of Asian Americans and about Asian Americans. I recently participated in my son's school district for the 11th grade US history textbook. And all the books, there was no more than 2 pages of any discussion of Asian Americans in all of US history. And then, I was personally interested in the Vietnam War, because that's what, I have strong memories of when that was taught to me, and going home and asking my dad, like, hey, is this how it went down? And he was just like, no. And then realizing that now as an adult and having this perspective looking back, because all of the discussion in the books were about the military in the US. There was no discussion about the Vietnamese people, and especially not of the Vietnamese people who came to the US after. And so I was completely invisible in the experience, while we learned about all the things that the US tried to do to save my people, and all these images of my people dead in my textbook. And yet I was still asked to memorize this, learn this. I mean, how could you not have anxiety and become numb to seeing your people dead, right? And this is, like I said, this is true for all of our communities, right? That we need to be thinking about how these systemic things impact the individual, and how then, by the time they come to us, how then it has become an internal problem, right? But it didn't necessarily start there. Yeah. Michael says, thank you for such an informative presentation. I thought the clinical practice and responsibility slides were great pieces of insight on how to better support our communities. I was wondering, how can we promote these discussions further at schools and universities without placing extra work for Asian Americans to be responsible for implementing such efforts? Good question. I wish there was more we could ask of folks to do, because obviously I have done my part of this work and tried to say yes to as many of these talks as I possibly can. I think there's a striking of a balance, right? That for us, it has to be, there's something I think important about nothing about us without us, right? The saying from the disabilities movement. And I think it's important for all of us to see that our struggles are around feeling unimportant, lacking sense of belonging, that when we kind of think about the shared common feelings, right? And I think in our discipline, at least, that becomes a little bit easier, is to coalesce around the sense of we need to support our communities, we need to support people. How can we become more flexible and know enough in order to support people? And so asking people to think about, right? Well, what is this like? To think about bringing it in ourselves. I think it's okay for us to bring up the conversation and maybe not always have the answer. I think some of us, again, the system has intentionally miseducated us in what our role is in things that feel like diversity, right? So oftentimes, I think students come into a room in a conversation about, if we just talk about depression, right? And then they don't immediately ask, well, is this true for Asian Americans too? Right? That they have been trained to just believe that everything is for everyone rather than asking the question, right? So the more you bring it up, even when you don't have the answer, the more you're not the expert, you're just merely bringing in the conversation. So I would encourage us to do that. And it's the same thing that we would do in clinical practice, right? Be curious. So get curious out loud, get curious in public. Don't just be curious about Asian Americans, be curious about everyone. Model the behavior that we want, right? Which is to consult about everything. I keep telling my students all the time, I was like, you don't need to know the answers to everything. You just need to know when to consult and to go find the answer. Go figure it out. Go figure out what parts of you are being anti-Asian right now. What is preventing you from doing the work and asking the question that you need to ask, right? A lot of students, Asian American students, have the most difficult time working with fellow Asian Americans, especially younger Asian Americans with elders, right? And the age difference there will prevent them from asking really important questions, right? Why? How can we think about what you've been through, what you've been trained with, and why you can't do this? It's all, I think, coming back to the basics of what we're doing, right? The micro skills and the getting curious. You don't need to know the answer. So I would say that bring the question up, bring visibility, and don't take responsibility. Have good boundaries, right? It is not your responsibility to necessarily have the answer, but maybe it is your responsibility to bring visibility. So think of it that way. What is your responsibility and what is not? And hold the line, right? And do it for others as well. Not just like, that's where we model for each other. And if we can do that in the training environment, I suspect that there will be, that we will be modeling a new generation's way of doing cultural humility, right? That I don't know, it's really nice to know that anti-Asian hate like conjures an image now and conjures a conversation that it never did. It certainly didn't in my I was still fighting in grad school too, that Asians were a worthy spotlight as well. And I feel like it's an unfortunate reality that violence and this level of publicity is what took it to a national awareness. But here we are. And then now we use it. We use it to our benefit because otherwise we lose the moment. Right. I hope that answers your question, Michael.
I wanted to hop in and thank you so much for your thoughts on this wonderful talk. And I was particularly struck by your conversation around young adults and individuation versus community, and or along with and intersecting with community and intersecting identities. And I'm a college counselor. I'm at a college counseling center. It's a conversation I have with a lot of students who feel really torn. And I felt like your perspective was so rich and I really appreciated it. And if there's anything else you want to expand on in that arena, I would really love that.
Yes, I do. This came to mind as you were saying, that another moment that I hear that we have some work on that shows that maybe Asian Americans and Asian American families and community members do a little bit differently is the coming out process. So sexual orientation, gender identity, that we often think about it as an individual decision, right? I'm gonna come out to my parents, okay, great. But now my parents are saying I'm not allowed to come out to anyone else and that they're not ready for me to come out. And oftentimes, you know, then we'll work with the student to ask them, well, what do you want, right? And if you really want this, maybe you have to, you know, have boundaries with your parents, and maybe you do have to cut them out of your life so that you can have this other thing. And that can be really dangerous because if a person is already isolated, now you're going to cut them off from the one thing they know. And so often just asking, well, how important are your, let's say, your parents, right? How important is it for them to be okay with your process? How important is it for you that they are okay with it? And how can you keep that conversation going? Because if something as simple, not so simple, but like making the decision about what your major is a family decision, then why wouldn't coming out to the world be a family decision, right? Marriage is a family decision. So is expression of who you are, right? Changes to you are changes to the whole. And so if that's true, then we need to keep exploring what that means and not pushing just for what we know, which is, you know, what do you want? What do you want? It's like, I told you what I want. I hear students come to me all the time because they don't like their counseling experience. And they said, I told her what I want is to make my mom happy. And they're just like, that's not an okay decision. It's like, well, how come that's not an okay decision? And that happens a lot. A lot of people will say, because it's not my decision. I'm like, no, that is your decision. Your decision is to make your mom happy. Your decision can change next time, you know? But if that's important to you, let's talk about how to have a conversation with your mom and to be able to share how you feel. And that parental relationship then becomes more important than the coming out part, right? But we fixate on the coming out part because that's the individual need rather than the relational need of maintaining connection with my mom and my family. And that, I think, is a fallacy, right? And that we have to honor that there is a process here, that perhaps what we're hearing our clients say is that the relationship is more important to me. And I really want to do this thing, but how can I keep this? I want this, right? And I think when you can interrogate, okay, well, where does that come from? Why am I saying that it's not okay for them to do, like, why can't they be in relationship with their mom? Why can't they hold off on coming out, even though we really want that for them, right? I think that's what came to mind for me. It's like another moment that is important to honor for students, especially for that age group, right?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Thanks, everyone. It's 8:01. Our session is almost over. Those people who have questions can stay. Other than that, you know, you can log off. Nida, would you like to go with the closing remarks?
Of course. So we just want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I would like to invite you to complete our post-survey link that is being added to the chat now. Your responses to our survey will help us in planning future sessions. Our next speaker series will be on June 23rd at 7 p.m., in which Dr. Georgina Gross will be joining us. And the title of their talk is "To be visibly queer is to choose happiness over safety, caring for LGBT+ veterans and trainees." I would like to end by mentioning that our ability to maintain the social justice speaker series is through fundraising, and we greatly appreciate all donations moving forward. If you are able to support, the donation link is now being added to the chat. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all next month.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tran. It was wonderful. A great help
Oh,
for teachers and providers. And
thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm happy to be able to be in community with you all, and that next talk sounds really good. So thank you so much for the series.
Thank you.
No, this is wonderful. It's so interesting to me when you kind of brought up the whole collectivistic culture and individualistic culture, because that's something that we see not just in Asian American communities, but also in like Middle Eastern communities. And so those are things that I thought about a lot. And that was one of the reasons why I didn't go the clinical route, knowing that when I was an undergrad, much of the training was they have to individualize. I was sitting there thinking, how would this work with Middle Eastern families? Because you can't tell the parents of a minor that to get them to feel better, you have to kind of back off and they have to make their own decisions. And so it's just interesting to me when you kind of bring all this up that, you know, these are things that are still issues nowadays. And it seems as though there's been a lot more research and there are better practices available compared to kind of the minimal training I had as an undergrad to now.
Oh, it's so true. And even, you know, I talk to my students all the time around like they want to bring in all this mindfulness. I'm like, do you know where mindfulness comes from? How about you go learn mindfulness from your temple rather than, it's free if you go to the temple and ask them to teach you. And, some of them who have returned to their Buddhist roots are finding like, oh, it's so much more meaningful because a lot of the co-opted appropriated versions of it stop with the individual. Right? Like, let's be mindful so we can feel better. Let's slow down our breathing. And it's like, you forgot the last part, which is remember you're human and that you're not alone in this. Now, like there's this like human component that we completely stripped from it because we don't want to get too religious about it, or like we don't want to, it's and that I think it's that, right? It's like because we're scared of being too Asian. Because then, because now you're leaving Christianity, which is a big no-no for a lot of people, right? You don't practice other religions, which I'm saying, well, if you want to practice mindfulness, you're going to have to get real with that, right? It's the same thing as when we ask folks, like, if you want to practice anti-racism, you're going to have to deal with white privilege, right? Like, so if we can ask for one, we can ask for the other, right? It's in the same vein of conversation. It's difficult, it's uncomfortable, but especially for Asian Americans, they're forgetting that you're doing it, you're learning about it through white folks, and that's okay, but it's not okay for you to go to the monks who taught it originally, right? And uncovering that bias for themselves. Like that's where it's like you don't need to go fight anti-Asian racism on the streets. You need to start at home because you're carrying it. Because you can't do it. You can't say your name. Like you're not using your own name. How can you help kids? Or you're not using your own practices, So anyhow, yeah, it's a sad reality, I think, when you start thinking about how deeply it runs in our country. But I will not keep you longer. But thank you so much for letting me rant about this and taking it seriously.
Thank you. In the chat, we had two things. One of them, just a call for teamwork. Drive for justice. That is extremely important. And the other thing was that audience wanted to know if they can have your resource.
Oh yeah, I can send that to you. So that way it's actually clickable in an email. So yeah, I will do that for you. But yeah, I definitely think it's teamwork. Thinking a lot about what's happening in Texas, and I've been fighting for services for my kid, and it got getting into a fight with them and realizing today that I had to invoke. I was like, I'm like, I'm a psychologist. What are you? They were trying to tell me that a 15-minute observation is sufficient. And I was like, no, who does a 15-minute observation? So anyway, it was one of these where my son is holds it together all day and then like blows up at night because his whole life is miserable, right? And they're telling me that he's fine because at school he's participating, he's happy, he's fine. I'm like, he's not fine. You're sending him home to me broken. And I had to send them an article to be like, no, Asian kids hold it together and then they fall apart. So you have to listen and you have to engage and ask. And that is how, like, that is the pattern. And yeah, so for them, right? If you don't express your anger and your feelings in this very easy to understand way at the right moment, you don't get services, you don't get help because you're happy. And then we end up later with Asian Americans who don't understand feelings, and you wonder why. So yeah, it's tough work. But okay, I will stop there.
But your work is meaningful, and that's
Thank you so much. I appreciate
all
that.
that matters at the end of the day is that you're helping to spread this awareness. And I think also, like when you brought some just about your son, I think oftentimes when there are young children that are developing within a culture that is more collectivistic, where how they act represents the family, they tend to kind of hold that in until they're at home and they know they can get away with kind of letting all that out. And I've seen a lot of similar things with many family friends of mine who come from the Persian community where, the kids hold it in, and then at home is when things come out and they'll reach out to close friends who they know won't tell others about the problems they're dealing with. But the symptoms tend to look really different because they hold it in so much and they don't want to show to others.
Well, isn't that ironic? Because aren't we also using that same complaint to say that some kids are acting out at school because they feel safe there? And I'm like, well, what do you think is happening for Asian American kids that they're not acting out at school? The parallel of this is because they don't trust you to understand. They don't trust you. How can you build trust with the kids? Because they're exploding at home where they feel safe. So why, like, we haven't quite made the full circle link there, right? And again, I feel like that's where our biases are, where we will use what is easy for us in some situations, but not others, for some students, but not others, right? So going back to, it's not asking for a colorblind experience, but also like good clinical practice, good education does mean asking the same questions in its entirety, So, and now I have to go pick up my little one, but yeah, it's pickup time here on the West Coast. But I really appreciate you all making space. Thank you, Minna, for inviting me to do this.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks
Bye-bye.
again. Take care.
Okay. Bye.